Yeah, always.
Do you want to go ahead, Bea?
Sure. Hello, take two. Hello, everybody. Again. This is the Sex Positivity Panel. My name is Bea.
I could do that, yeah.
I'm an educator, and I also do work around
I didn't even think about
morality, consent, sex, and sometimes AI. I lump AI into all of that sometimes. I'm hoping to pursue further study in human sexuality once I finish my undergrad, and I'm also really into safety tools and looking into vol 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 I keep getting stuck on that word vol 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 vulnerability. There we go. In games and tabletop role-playing games. And one of the events that I ran last year at another double exposure event was about safety tools consent.
Yeah.
I'm now gonna hand over to
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you hear me first?
Thank you so much. I'm Meg Baker, and I'm a certified sex ed teacher for 12-year-olds through 18-year-olds, 7th grade to senior high school. And I've written curricula for adults as well, and also for parents dealing with navigating their children's emergent healthy sexuality. A constant thread in my game design involves consent and agency, and that spills over naturally into conversation tools that create a more healthy environment to talk about difficult or challenging or vulnerable subjects. And I co-wrote Apocalypse World, which is notorious for having special rules and special consideration for sexuality of players of characters in tabletop role-playing game, and that spills into Powered by the Apocalypse and rising attention over the past decade to concepts and questions around how do we navigate sex and sexuality in our characters as part of the role-playing experience. So I'm very excited for this panel. Thank you so much for putting this together, and let's go.
Let's go. So we came up with some questions based off of what I said to Meg that I wanted, like how I had envisioned the panel. And the first question we got is, when we talk about sex positive games, what do we mean by that?
Yeah.
Do you wanna?
Yeah, do you want to go first?
All right, cool. Yeah, I.
How about you go first?
Awesome. So when I personally talk about what it means to be sex positive, the main thing that I want people to recognize is that there isn't any inherent connection between like the amount of sex someone has or how good or bad of a person they are. And that I think expands to the idea that the cornerstone for romantic or sexual activity is consent, and consent. So consent consent is kind of like a separate entity to the preachy idea of like, oh, if you have X amount of sex, you are bad. If you have Y amount of sex, you are less bad, or whatever. And when I think about like something that isn't sex positive, I think about that space where like sex itself is fetishized, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
And what I think about when I think about sex positive games is the space that comes between being too clinical or serious, and the space that comes that is like also outside of like when you may be embarrassed by something and you're trying to make it salacious or saying like, oh, isn't this like dirty or naughty? So I quite like to, when I envision a sex positive game, I envision like that space in between, but it isn't. It's sort of a mix of the two, but not really, because both of the things I just described aren't great. But yeah, I have lots to say about the middle space where you can have fun and like you can laugh, and it is a serious endeavor in some ways, but lighthearted in others.
Yeah, I feel like for me, sex positivity in gaming is that no one is being shamed. You know, that if you're playing a character who is really sexually active, or if you're playing a character who is wrestling with their sexual identity, or you're playing a character who is asexual and has zero interest, or aromantic and has zero interest in that aspect, but there's no shaming in it, and that a sex positive game is aware of some gender balance, that there's or gender diversity, that it's not like all of these characters who identify as this one gender and then this one token of another gender. That it's an awareness in board games, or like thinking of Clue for some reason, and like the way that like Miss White and Miss Scarlet and Mr. Peacock and Mr. Green wind up given art in traditional Clue board game that like really infers different types of sexuality, and like whether they're hypersexualized or undersexualized and things like that. And that spills over, of course, into role-playing games even more, because we are creating a character. And I think also the bit that you touched on there, be about language. I've done whole panels at METATOPIA and other places called Sex on the Table, where I basically talk about the 5 different languages of sexuality, and the clinical language is, clinical and medical. You need that. You have to know what the actual names for your body parts and actions are, so you can talk about them if you need them. And that there is the familial, which is often that sort of goofy euphemism, like polite language you would use with like somebody else's grandmother in the room, or to a young child, that sort of thing. And then there's the sort of among peers, and that's where we get all of like what feels good. That middle place of talking about sex in a game or at a table or making jokes is the place where we're among peers and we feel good about that, and we can do like, oh my god, this thing where whatever, because we're among peers. And then there's like vulgar, like vigorous, vulgar, street stuff that can be used to inflict harm. And that's where you get slurs and abuse and harassment. And then you have intimate language, which is what a pair of intimate partners or more, what a select bit of intimate partners use, and that's language that's specific to them. So in terms of finding a place that's sex positive, for me, being aware of those 5 languages as we are at the table and as we're designing games, that we can use those intentionally. And so when I'm writing a game text and I'm talking about like your character's sexuality, I might be more clinical, because it's not appropriate for me to use an intimate language, because I'm talking about your character. I'm saying, in considering your character's sexuality, consider whether they are heterosexual or homosexual or whatever. I'm going to be using clinical, not clinical words, but that space also informs how we talk with each other, which I think is what you were getting at. Like, we don't want to tip over into goofiness where people are feeling unheard, and we don't want to tip over into clinical language that can be sterilizing and isolating in that way, off-putting. So all of that piece, like this, what is a sex positive game to me? It's one where we feel good about our sexuality when playing it, and it doesn't have to be about sex. It really doesn't, and I think that's a really important thing, because we could be talking about like all kinds of games and all kinds of play here, and it's really important for me that I say, and you may have a different opinion, but for me, sex positive doesn't mean it's a game about sex or even about religion. It just means that it is aware at some point in the design or play of supporting the expression of sexuality that doesn't shame people.
Yeah.
How's that?
Yeah. Wow. That's brilliant. I really like what you said about like not tipping over into goofiness, because when I was laying out my own, what's it called, floor plan. No.
It'll work.
My method for like the continuum in a sense of like here's where it's clinical, here's the sweet spot, the just right spot, and then it like tips over into something else, which is also bad. I personally the spot that I think is like a good and sex positive spot is a spot where it's where a game or an interaction is silly, not in the fact that it's goofy, but silly in the fact that the what I can't say the vulnerability of players can be captured in a like, oh, this is sometimes an awkward topic, but we're like broaching it, and we're broaching it in a way that is like careful and has an edge of being silly, but not in the like, oh, this is just like so wild and weird. It's the point where people are aware that like we're talking about sex or relationships, there is some degree of like, this is new territory, but it doesn't. But the way that we compensate for that isn't saying, oh, we're like being so rude or whatever, or saying, or saying that we should be cynical. I think we can have. There's a lot of insight to be gotten from like when we talk about games that focus on sex or games that focus on relationships. I think there's a lot of value in taking elements of seriousness and elements of lightheartedness and combining those together, but not in the way that that becomes the place where you're saying like, oh, this is just like rude and this is wrong, because that is the place where it takes it into shaming, and that's exactly what we don't want to do.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that's interesting in what you just said is like sexuality, no matter how you express it, it is goofy. Like, what? It's phenomenal. Everything about it is goofy, and everything about it is really serious. You know, simultaneous truths. And so, if we can act from a place where we recognize it's just accept that like we can be goofy in our expression of sexuality and in our character's expression of sexuality. We can recognize that the whole thing is ridiculous objectively, but we don't have to be in a way that makes people shut down either because it's too ridiculous and they're going to check out from what happens next, or it's too upsetting and they're going to check out from what happens next. And like when I'm teaching, I do a whole thing with like figuring out all the words that you can use, every single word that we can use for every body part and every action. Put the like scientific name at the top, and then all the students like fill the pages with like every slang word we can come up with, and then we have a conversation about what ones we will agree for that class not to use because they're too upsetting, too like weird, or whatever. It's a process of consent and building agency from the beginning. That like and that's a game, right? That's a sex ed game right there. To build consent and agency that you can say anything, and then that we will respect your boundaries. That we can get it all out there, and then we'll together find the boundary place of what we agree collectively to use as language within that place. I think, does that sort of solidify our position on sex positivity in games?
I think so, yeah. I might want to like touch on a bit more about like shame and shame within the like board game and tabletop space, because I think a lot of the reason why maybe a lot of people don't want to use specific words, so sometimes it is from a place of like, no, this is wrong and I don't want that, and a lot of some other parts of the time I think it like not wanting to someone's reason for not wanting to explore a specific scenario or use a specific word when they actually do want to explore that scenario, maybe shame or maybe and it might really have to do with the people at the table too. I think it's very much worth talking about how our attitudes towards sex and our attitudes to portraying or talking about relationships or sex within games can very much depend on the people we're at the table with, whether they're friends, whether they're strangers, whether they're family who you.
Oh my god.
Who you really might not want to discuss any aspects of sex with.
Right. Like I am gonna have a way more sexy game, like a sexy game with people I know well who are not my adult children. Like I have a 25-year-old, a 21-year-old, and an almost 16-year-old, and like the older two are fully adults, right? And none of them are foolish, and they've grown up. Not foolish, like none of them are naive about morality. They're incredibly nuanced. They're very informed, and they've grown up with me as a sex ed teacher and her mom, so they've known since a very young age. We talk about it all the time, but it's inappropriate for me to play a game with them that has that, like who our characters are flirting. That would be really weird and inappropriate because while we're saying that we don't want to be in a place where we're shaming anybody for their sexuality, part of our human primate structure is the social configuration, and recognizing that the emotions in the social configuration of primates does involve inhibition, right? For very good reasons. And it does involve senses of like, oh, maybe this isn't for here. Maybe this is not something I need to be sharing with all of these people, right? That's healthy. That's not like oh, you're bad sort of shaming. That's a place of like, maybe this isn't really the right time for me to lay out my personal kink here in front of a group of strangers at a convention, or among my family, like, So I think that it's important when we talk about shame, that the piece that we're acknowledging, at least for me, is a condemnation of someone else's healthy expression of sexuality.
Yeah, that's perfect. Definitely.
Yeah.
I love that a lot.
Yeah. Because it's really, I also really want anyone listening to not feel pressure to be more vulnerable and to be more explicit and to be more than they're comfortable with at a table in terms of sexual stories, because it's always fine to hold your own boundaries. It's always fine to be like, cool, we're playing characters who are lovers, and there's what's going on, and now they're going to go spend some time alone together, and we're not going to follow them. We're going to let them do that, and then they maybe will come back after and be like, boy, that was fun, and that's fine. We do not need to go into details that are uncomfortable for people, and that comes to what you were saying about like playing with strangers at a convention or playing with friends. That awareness of your own boundaries and your respect for other people's boundaries, like to have that conversation at the beginning, like, what are we doing? What are we here to do? Are we comfortable with like how explicit are we going to be? And what's off the table? And what are we actually doing? Like, if we're playing checkers, probably not a sexy fun time conversation going to happen. But if we're playing Fog of Love or Consentacle, there's a direct incentive that like you're here to play a sexy fun time game. That's how it goes. Or if you're playing Sexy Fun Times, which I think is A003's.
Oh wow, I have not.
Yeah.
I actually haven't heard of that game. I really should check that out.
Yeah, I'd have to track them down and say, all right, is it called Sexy Fun Times? It might be called Sexy Fun Times. Anyway, shout out to A003. We'll find it later. Anyway, next question.
Yeah, we spent almost half of the time answering the question. This just shows how wonderful this could go on. So the second question we came up with was what are some examples of sex positive games and what in their design makes them sex-positive games.
I feel like we just touched on that a little bit.
A little bit,
on
yeah.
and consent.
I have much more to say about both those games, especially as I specifically wrote those games in child description. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you wanna see if there's other questions on our list that you feel like we can hit quick and then circle back to that?
Ooh, yeah, let's
Good observation. We are
well,
a
I mean,
third of the way through.
you wrote some like really good, really open-ended questions for this panel. So I'm one that might be a bit quicker than all the others is what mechanics help to support sex-positive games.
Yeah, that's good. And I have a real short answer, which is anything that any mechanic that supports a player's agency and consent, and any mechanic that gives the players at the start of the game an opportunity for setting their boundaries and getting their continual consent buy-in. Like, this is what we're going to do. If you're playing this scary game, like a really, like, I think there's another piece in this, which is about, like, going into any situation. If you're playing a really scary, spooky horror game, you calibrate that more. Like, do I want Scooby-Doo or do I want, Saw? And, like, personally, I'll be on the side of Scooby-Doo every single time in that equation. And you can do the same thing with sexuality. So that's my quick take on mechanics. It's just constantly have an eye toward, does it reinforce their consent and agency at every step?
That's really nice to think about. I really like that, and I really like thinking of mechanics as like things that like the what you just told me and the audience was like it was very broad, like, but I like that in a mechanic because a lot of people think mechanics have to be like very specific or like very like every time X happens you have 2 Y's and an S, like, no. I just really like if you have a broad spectrum of like what a mechanic can be in order to help sex-positive games be sex-positive, then it's very much it is now much easier to zero in on how to make those mechanics more specific. It's like when I look at the safety tool checklist and I look at and imagine, for example, that no one had ticked any boxes, like no one wanted to fill up the sheets or something. I as a game master in that situation might feel scared because the entire world seems to be open to me, but once any part of that world is closed off to me, or part of that world someone's like, no, let's not have whatever, then it becomes much easier to zero in on what I want that world to be, what I want that campaign to be, for example, because I have some sort of boundary.
Right. Yeah, you have a constraint, and everything affordances constraints, affordances is where I consent, constraints is where my boundaries are.
Mm-hmm.
And you can set that for your campaign as well.
Do you have any ideas about what mechanics help support sex-positive games, like more specifically than the wide one that we just talked about?
Well, it's interesting because I do, but also I'm aware that part of our focus is like the whole breadth of games. We're talking about board games. That's very, very different from role-playing games. In some board games, there's an element of recognizing sexuality, but not as many, right? It's still a very, very fruitful place for board game design, and that's why Consentacle exists and Pocketboard exists, is because it's kind of new territory for that sort of thing. I mean, it's been around conceptually, games with sexual content, like tabletop board games with sexual content. Like, there was a whole bunch of them in the 70s that we basically don't see anymore because they were like kind of the new, they were not mainstream games necessarily. or you get ones that are super jokey. You know, they're like adult party games. You know, and it's a whole different genre. So I would hesitate, frankly, to narrow it down because your game, hypothetical you, is gonna need different mechanics. And if you just have some bedrock understanding of like everything you're doing in your design, how does this support the player's consent and agency? You know, because it would be, I can't actually come up with. Here's an example of mechanic. Like there's mechanics in that I can point to, and there's mechanics in. I'm sure there are mechanics in other games that I can dig out. I really like what's the one? Slash is a fun card game, really fun card game that has that's a mechanic about slash fiction, and you have a handful of cards, and you have a handful of cards that has the name of a character or the name of from any kind of property out there, like Han Solo and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and then there's a prompt on the table like, is it a meet cute? Is it a friends to enemies to lovers? And you create your little scenario. And there's really nice construction in that game about how to get the table consent for like what's our boundaries. So I really like, if I was looking at board games, card games, I would look at Slash as well as the other two you mentioned.
Nice. Awesome. What else? I had so much to say now, so
I'm sorry.
it's okay. In the realm of design for sex ed rather than designing specifically for sex positivity, do you think games like Fog of Love and Consentacle specifically have like, would you say they have sway in the board game community as tools for sex ed?
Oh, I think that's really fascinating. What do you think? Can you answer that first?
Yeah, sure. I have so much to say about Fog of Love. So I found it really interesting to think about how Jake Jodashkov designed Fog of Love by reading a lot of texts about how love and romance and relationships work, and also by watching a lot of rom-coms basically, and I really like that balance in looking at the serious topics and then having the light-hearted stuff, and it isn't even a balance per se, it's more like they're melded together. I think that works really well in the game, and I think Fog of Love can be used really well to teach younger teens possibly about love, about relationships, about the consequences of your actions, and I really like and I just really love the way that games can allow us to capitalize on the lack of real life consequences, but do so in a way that even though we know there are no real life consequences, we can do things without hurting people. And if we do want to enact some sort of scene where one character betrays another character, that can work in a way where it's a learning curve or a learning experience rather than actually being in real life and seeing that you have been betrayed by a partner.
Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more. I think that's an excellent analysis, and I think that that underlines the whole purpose in playing games. Period, is to put ourselves in a situation that we are not in, and practice different ways of how we might respond. And there's a ton of what we do in role playing and in board games that are as that's more fanciful, more escapist. It's like, I'm for some reason thinking of the game Keep Cool, where like the point is dealing with climate disaster, and like how are you going to balance your factory's needs against the climate's needs? Like we're not in that situation, but it sure does generate conversation and thought, which is most of the point. And with relationship games, like absolutely, your whole thing is practice for how might you be in that situation. How would it feel? What would you do? How could you be a version of yourself? And anytime you're creating a character, you're creating some version of yourself. We cannot create things that are outside of ourselves. And so if I'm making a character that's particularly callous with other people's feelings, I'm exploring the places in myself where maybe I need better boundaries. Maybe I need in my daily life to put people off more. And if I'm being more vulnerable in a game, maybe I'm practicing how I might be more vulnerable in person. And like one of the things that I see all the time is young people, discovering their own sexuality, specifically around gender orientation and attraction components of sexuality through gaming. Like, wait a minute. I started playing this game, and it turns out my character is gay, and that allows me to examine that aspect of myself and figure out if that's a truth for me, or if it's just a way that I'm building empathy, because that's a whole other. I don't have to be like, I am this thing to step into that space for a time being, which I think is part of sex ed profoundly, because
Absolutely,
yeah.
There's this like tweet that goes around Twitter every few like months or something, and it's cat, and it's something like you always have someone in your party who's like working through stuff around their agenda, and I think that is oftentimes very true. But I do like the fact that you linked this back to empathy and how games can be a huge a huge
The word that comes to my mind is touchstone, but I don't know if touchstone is the thing you're looking for.
Yes, a huge touchstone for empathy, and purposely putting yourself in the shoes of a character who you are not, and trying to formulate the ways that character would respond to experiencing certain things. There was something else I wanted to say about. One mechanic I absolutely love in Form of Love is you hide your character traits from the other player. If I remember correctly, I think I am correct. And that I think is extremely true to real life, in the sense that your partner can never fully know who you are in the way that you do. And some people would argue that you don't fully know who you are. That's a whole other conversation.
True.
Yeah. And the mechanics in Fog Love that I really love are the fact that you are working towards a common goal, but you are working towards your own goals too, and you need to be able to meet those goals to say that you would stay true to your character, because obviously you don't mold yourself to suit another person. You want to. I could talk about this for ages. The fact that you are able to be influenced by friends, or like in a real life place, or able to be influenced by friends, by family, by romantic partners. But once you start molding yourself to them, it is unhealthy. And I think that those mechanics of you cannot fundamentally change who your character is, are very useful mechanics, especially to get teens to engage with. So,
I like all this stuff. No, we're like, I want to talk about this for like 5 hours. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, I did have I introduced my love to some friend a year or so ago, but what they did is they kind of broke the game. They decided to play D&D with the game and kind of break the mechanics of like having specific character traits. And I found that did work quite well because they had fun and they used the cards and everything, and that was good. But I do really love the mechanic of you should be changing who your character is and just the traits they have in order to win the game, even if it's co-op.
I'm thinking of Emily Caraboss's game, Breaking the Ice, and the same thing, like trying to figure out who each other is, and like, are we going to be a thing or not? But we're taking on opposite roles in some way. Like, how do I step into your shoes and be empathetic and try to learn about you while I'm not you, and to maintain your own self-boundary set of identity in that process of merging, right? Because to have a functional relationship, there is some degree of enmeshment. It just can't be like that, It can't be that one subsumes the other. It has to be that we have an overlapping sense of what we do and how we are, and that we take each other's needs and realities into consideration. And so, like, that's such a good and important balance, because I feel like, not to get too politically topical, but one of the things going on right now in the world, like, we can, all of us, stand to be a little bit more concerned with the well-being of other people. If we had just universally had a little bit more, like, what is for the greatest safety and well-being of the people around me, maybe we'd be doing this in person. So that's a whole other piece there, like making sure that the things we're teaching through games and the things we're thinking about in terms of our identity and sexuality and boundaries and all that is also considerate and mindful of the people around us. And that's back to the empathy teaching. We are at 40 minutes in. Do we want to ask if there's questions, or do you want to keep going with our
Sure. Are there any questions in the Twitch chat?
questions from the chat?
So far, there are no questions. So if you've got more content, go for it.
Great, we'll do it.
Cool. Yeah, we do have some more content.
It is early early on a Friday morning here, so
It is late on a Friday afternoon here. Something that I wanted to just bring up briefly about a mechanic that I think is actively not great if you're trying to build a sex positive game and you include this mechanic. It's I don't like the idea of sex and consent and romance-based games that are built on winning, so one person wins and everyone else loses. I do not like that mechanic. And that's why I love. I am just a Fog of Love stan account. This is why I love how in Fog of Love there is winning as an individual within winning as a team, because that's what a relationship should be, right? You should win as an individual, but not at the expense of winning as a team, unless winning as a team just isn't possible, and maybe you should break up, or maybe you just don't work together. But yeah, that is a mechanic in Fog of Love that I absolutely love. And if you are building a sex or romance-based game where the aim is that one person wins and everyone else loses, I don't think that is a sex positive game.
I agree. I could not agree more. Like, that's the idea that somebody is winning at a relationship and like wearing someone else down so that they can win at a human relationship is horrifically bad, right? That is just bad, and I think that speaks to game design history. That so many of our games, from board games, card games, role-playing games, so many of our games have in their ancestry competition, and where it is about like, can my hand of cards beat your hand of cards, or can I maneuver my pieces and surround and defeat and capture yours, and can my player character just pummel your character into submission, and like none of those phrasings are things you want to because I want around a relationship. Are you kidding? No. No. So yeah, that touches back on our mechanics point earlier. Like, here are some mechanics not to do.
Yeah, I think this leads us very well into talking about more about how the ethics and empathy can contribute or create a sex positive experience in gaming. And when I think about that, I think of obviously like when you play games that consider sex positive, they are more often than not co-op, and if you have to work together to play the game, there is a lot more empathy involved from the get-go via that game, because you really have to take the other person's needs into account, what they're doing, focus on working with them instead of in a competitive game where you just like, I am the best and I will crush you because this is the Game of Thrones board game, which is basically all about competing and lying and pretending to make alliances with people and then cutting you off entirely.
I think like one of the things in this question is about the intent of the game, because there's games out there like Diplomacy, which are all about the backstabbing. It's all about like construct these, strange relationships. Diplomacy is very political, it's not necessarily interpersonal, but the sense of like, one of the things that I've watched people playing Diplomacy look for is they look for that moment of like when their diplomatic moves are going to totally betray, their another, like, and suddenly the field of conflict changes. That's great if that's the buy-in for your game. Fabulous, that's fun. It's the same reason people might go on, extreme roller coasters or whatever else. Like, they're looking for that, or watch super spooky movies or whatever. It's not that it's not fun. It's just like be clear what your intention in fun is, and the idea that that you have an opportunity to talk about or generate conversations on after the game about empathy and consent and support and the give and take in a relationship, and how I not only in a cooperative game am aware of like working together, but that I value your that I intrinsically, because we're trying to work together to do something, to build something, to make something in the world, even if it's just winning the game. Even if it's just like, yay, we all did the thing. Forbidden Desert and Forbidden Island. Do you know those games? Forbidden Desert, they're tile placement games, and you each have pawns, and you're trying to work together to achieve a goal. I love them, and everybody, especially Forbidden Desert, is really great. Forbidden Island is also fantastic. Forbidden Sky is more challenging. But the point is that it does a really good job. Forbidden Desert does a really good job of recognizing each person's agency and capacity and like ability to help the common goal. We really need everybody to work together for the common goal. And it is not a given, right? Because there's a storm that's going to keep making things worse and making things worse and making things worse. But it is achievable if you work together. And if you, like, I've played it a bunch of times with the family, and like it's really, really interesting to play with a group, to watch the learning curve within the game, from like, oh, we're just figuring out how this game we don't really know, to like, oh, it's like this, to, oh, it's like this, to like, oh, we can play on a harder setting now because we know how to trust each other and interact and what the relationship patterns are. And so, yeah, maybe it's possible when there's tons of games out there. Just,
Yeah, and speaking of like playing games on a harder setting and stuff, I have a really hard time knowing what I think about Consentacle because with Consentacle I only recently actually realized that it came about like due to a boycott of another game that used that was all about tentacles that handled sex in a very damaging way. And what I'm struggling with on Consentacle is that there's the element of the unknown, there's the element of chance, and that sometimes worries me when you're looking at situations around consent because ideally the consent you have is very clear and mutual, and the clarity aspect of the consent is missing in Consentacle quite a lot, and that is the point of the game, and I understand that. But I I just think there's a lot to be said about that. But I'm very glad to see that that players still can like opt out of any action by choosing to withdraw consent because that's very accurate to the real world.
Yes. That, and I feel like that's the point in that is that I think you nailed it. That the need for consistent, enthusiastic consent, right? And that like we don't know what's happening here, and so we're in a place where that ambiguity is, as you're intentionally unclear. But I feel like the baseline message in Consentacle, if I was using this in a sex ed class, I'd be like, this is the piece. It's your ability to withdraw consent at any time for any reason. And that is an incredibly sex positive thing to have, to have it explicit, right? Because we have a lot of conversation tools that get used at games and gaming conventions. My favorite is script change. It's what I've always done, and both Sheldon articulated it really beautifully to help structure conversations around consent. But having it written right in like that is just beautiful.
I find it. I think it just speaks to how consent. This speaks to how much consent isn't written into our society. That it's not obvious to have consent within games because people are like, oh, this is not real life now. This is a game, and since consent very often isn't really spoken about or acknowledged in real life, especially in a non-sexual context, it's much more difficult to bring that up within a game, and especially if people are like, oh, well, there's no real consequences in such a game, blah blah blah, and especially when you have to consider the intersection between, hey, yeah, there are real consequences, but there kind of are because there are some psychological consequences, and stuff like that can really happen in games. So having rule books for games dedicate a few lines even to consent or to safety tools, if that's something that they want to do, is really helpful because it really makes me sad how easily consent can be dismissed in games and in real life places where sex and romance aren't involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my god, I could not agree more. And I also feel like there's like another piece of that, which is you mentioned that like there can be psychological ramifications of what you do in a game, and that's where we hit the place where having that level of remove of like, okay, it's not real life, it's just a game. And touching on what I said earlier about like trying on different experiences, but if you try on the experience of being someone who disregards consent, and it's like, well, that's just what I'm just playing the character, but the people at the table are looking at you like, what the hell? That is, don't do that. You have now bridged over into like real life issues with your fellow human beings at the table who are like, that was crappy behavior. And it might not be, as you just inferred, it might not be about a sexual relationship. It might be about anything. It might be Minecraft, and you're like doing your thing. You're like, I'm here with my magic pickaxe, and someone's like, don't cut down my tree, man. It's about consent, and it's about agency, and about listening to each other, listening to people, and recognizing that exactly as you said. I feel like that's the heart of this whole panel, is that consistent, enthusiastic consent isn't just for sex and relationships, just for sexuality. It's for being human together. Trying to be in that place.
Got just about 5 minutes.
5-minute warning. Okay. Do you want to wrap up? And where can we find you online and things like that?
Sure. Sure. Amazing. I'm good that it has been a relatively okay speech day for me, speech-wise. You can find me on Twitter at SoupDragonQueen. That's basically where I am. That's also my name on itch. I do not have much on itch at the moment, but I'm going to post stuff out soon, maybe once I finish my degree. Meg, where can we find you?
Night Sky Games on Twitter, and Patreon/Lumply, which will have all of the Baker House stuff, and itch. I'm the only Meguey Baker on the internet. If you Google Meguey Baker, it's me. There's no other one of me. So again, for a weird, yeah. Well, I have a intentional misspelling of an obscure Mexican floral name. So go figure. Yeah, I want to keep talking though. Like, is there any? We have like a whole another couple minutes. We have 5 minutes left.
We do. That's something that I was going to say, and then I was just like, oh yeah, that's something I want to say in regards to enthusiastic consent that I always want to bring up, which is I often like to get into enthusiastic consent in the way that for example, in a situation where two people either in real life or in a game have never had sex before, had a sexual encounter, I feel like sometimes the consent can be very solemn or very serious in the sense they are really checking being are you sure? I'm sure. And I wouldn't know whether to class that as enthusiastic consent, but I feel like it very much still counts.
Yeah, I do too. Because that's a really unique question. I think it does. I think because it's people feeling their way and trying to be extra sure and really careful with each other, attentive to, are we both comfortable with what's happening? And there can definitely be a place where yes, I want to kiss you. I am grabbing your face. You don't have to ask again. But checking in is always good. But I think that is part of, to me, that's an indication, hopefully, of the ways in which consent around sexual interaction is slowly percolating through broader culture. That people are aware of just check. Are you sure this is okay? Are you sure? And especially if it's in a role-playing game and you have the characters doing that, checking in, like, do you really want to? That's one level, but it's also, of course, the players saying, do you really want to? Giving the players an option to check in with themselves and be like, I'm actually not comfortable going further with this scene right now, or like, you know, anytime if we were playing a game and like our characters are checking in with each other in that way for the consent in a sexual scene, anytime that happens, it gives both of us an opportunity as players to say, cool, let's fade to black and see them having coffee the next morning. You know, it gives us a level to create our own, to hold our own boundaries. And that's also really part of why to do sex positive games and why that's all of this.
I could talk so much more about like the disconnect between player and character in relation to sex positive games, but we have 1 minute left. So is this the part where I say thank you everyone for tuning in to the panel. I had a marvelous time. Thank you so much, Meg. You have been brilliant, and I've learned so much from you. I hope to do this kind of thing again soon, and I hope everyone has a lovely Metatopia after this panel.
Thank you so much for doing this. This was great. I really appreciate having a chance to talk with you.
Thank you so much.